Hello guys, welcome to your video on Python programming tutorial. So in this video, we are going to be looking at how to declare and use variables in Python. So first, some brief literature. A variable, a variable serves as a name or a pointer to a particular value or object in memory. I'm going to be explaining that in a moment. A variable name can be any valid identifier. We have looked at identifier in a previous video. Variables are sometimes referred to as identifier, variable names, or simply variables. Python automatically creates a variable and makes it available for use once it is assigned a value. You must specify the type when declaring variable in type language. So I'm going to explain that briefly. All right, so in Python, what you can say a variable, when you use, when you're programming, you're going to be dealing with numbers, text, and all this stuff, all these kinds of things. So most times you want to store them temporarily somewhere. So we call these variables. Python helps you to store this by using a variable. Now, the variable, when you declare a variable and assign a value to it, Python is going to store it in memory for you. Now, if you want to get that variable back, you have to use the name you assign to that variable when declaring it. Now, the process of creating a variable is known as declaration, while the process of assigning a value to it is known as assignment, and that is done with the equal to sign. As you can see here, there is an equal to sign and assigning the value 100 to the variable counter. You see, now variable names are all identifiers. Now I'm going to be explaining something to you. So Python helps you store that variable in memory, while what you do now is you can always access that variable if you want. Now, in type languages, for example, you need to specify the type. For example, an integer here means a number without a decimal point. A float here means a number that has a decimal point, while a string is just a random number of text. And here we have strings here we have strings here. As you can see, here we have a boolean true or false. Now, Python is not a type language, it's an untyped language or a scripting language. So what happens is, once you declare a variable, once you assign a value, in this case 100, to a variable, in this case counter, what happens is Python will now create the variable and assign that value to it. Now, Python only creates a variable when you assign to it. Some programming language, you can declare a variable, that's writing out the variable, then later you assign to it. But in Python, when you assign to a variable, that's when the variable is created. All right, so here are variables. As you can see, this will be an integer. Python will record it as an integer. This will be a float. Python will record it as a float. Python knows it's a float because Python is a decimal. This is a text. Python knows. This is a boolean true or false. Python knows. So as you can see, we can print all these numbers and we get those values. So here are variables. Here are values. This is declaration and assignment. Assignment is when you use an equal to sign to assign a value to a variable. So here are different variables. And like we said, a variable must be a valid identifier. We have looked at identifier in previous video, so I'm not going to talk about it here. So here we are printing the type. Now to get the type of a variable, use the type operator. Now type counter, type distance, you can see we will have the different integer, float, string. So you see Python knows the type of the variable. You see Python knew the first one was an integer, it knows the second one is a float, it knows the other one is a string, and as you can see Python also knows about lists, booleans, tuples, dictionary, and complex. As you can see, Python knows them: boolean, tuple, dictionary, and complex. So Python determines the type of variables. Python determines the type of variables when we assign to them. So here is what happens when you create a variable. Python creates an object in memory. It stores the value, it stores the type, and it stores the reference count. That means how many variables point to that object. As you can see in this case, we created a variable called score 20.2. Python created an object. It knows it's a float because it has a decimal point. And in this case, since two identifiers have that value, Python only creates one of that object in memory, and it points these two identifiers to that location. So as you can see, it has a count of 2. We call this a reference count, while this has a count of 1. So as you can see, when you create a variable math, Python creates an object. It knows it's a string, so it saves the type as a string, and Python points that name variable identifier to that string. Now only one identifier points to this variable, so we can assign it the reference count of 1. So this is how Python creates object in memory when you create a variable. So as you can see, is the variable points to the object in memory. Python knows how to manage it. Whenever you require a variable, Python goes to memory and collects it. So these names are just like a tag to your variable in memory. So it's very important to use a name or a variable name. All right, now let's look forward. if you want to know the location of the memory, because like I told you, Python manages the location of the item in memory. But if you want to know the location of your variables, you can use the ID operator, and Python is going to show you the location. As you can see, here are some complex numbers which denotes the location of our item in memory. As you can see, you can use num2 equals to 200. If you print the memory location of num2, you see some complex stuff here. If you want to look at it in hexadecimal format, for those who don't know about hex, you don't need to worry. But if you want to print it in hexadecimal format, use the hex operator and before the ID, after the ID, and you're gonna see it in hexadecimal format. So these are memory locations of our different variables here: num1, num score, distance, name, num2, and here are other examples of variable. As you can see, we have variable 1, 2, 3, 4. But take note, like I told you, Python is not going to create a duplicate object for 50. It's going to point var1 to 50 and point var3 to the same object, while it's going to point var2 to an object which has 70 as value, and var4 to an object with that same object. So you're going to see from the memory location, you see this and this, that's var1 and var3 are the same in the same memory, even though they have different variable names, but they point to the same memory location, while var2 and var4 point to the same memory location, even though they have different variable names. So as you can see, once you declare a variable, you can use it within an operator. When you use the name, Python will go to memory and look for the value. So this is going to be, sum is going to be equals to 100 plus 2.50 plus 2.50. So once you use the name, Python gets the value and replace it with the name. So this is going to be 100 plus 2.50, as you can see, 102.5. Now, if you look at the memory location of counter and distance and hex, you're going to see different memory locations. So in other ways, you can also assign, instead of writing num1 equals to 50, score equals 50, speed equals 50, you can do it all in one line. Num2 equals to score, which is equals to 2, which is equals to speed 2. So this one receives 100, passes it to this one, and passes it to this one. Now, if you print all these values, you're going to realize that you're going to have 100, 100, 100. So instead of doing all this on separate lines, you can do it on a single line. All of them are going, so 100 is going to pass to speed 2. Score 2 now is equals to be that going to be 100 because speed 2 is 100, and num now is equals to going to be score 2, which is also 100. So you're going to have 100, 100, 100 like we have here. All right, so this was quite a long video which I wanted to try to explain to you guys how to use variables in Python. Declare and use. To declare variable, assign them values, and to show you how variables are stored as objects in memory by Python. All right, thanks, have a nice time, and see you in the next video.